a constant barrage of phone that we want. We don't answer. Generally, there's nothing there. I can get amused at times seeing phone number 000-000-000-000. They're able to spoof whatever they want. But lately, we've been getting some that the caller ID says, likely fraud. I thought, how good is that? I'm going to ignore it anyway, but thanks for the warning. We're going to continue with, I guess, this fun series this morning, one more week after this. Let us pray. Mighty God, we thank you because you are loving and good and constantly present. You've pursued us, you've claimed us, you've redeemed us. Father, I ask that what happens here today will be something that's done to honor you, and that as we share thoughts from Scripture and share thoughts from some of the history of our church, that eyes will be opened and minds may be challenged, but also that no one will be offended. I ask this in Jesus. Pray that I hope no one is offended you morning. I may be touching on some areas that are sensitive, but I will do so very carefully. Last week we looked at, from Revelation, but looked at this concept of being in the world, where we live, and how it influences how we think, how we feel, how we behave. The struggle of being in the world and not out of the world. And Peter called it being resident aliens. And most Christians in the U.S. don't like the thought of being resident aliens. We think of resident aliens as those people who are here trying to take our jobs or whatever. But the teaching in Scripture is that we should live in this world as if we don't belong here. Amen. That our ties are not to what is around us, but rather that our loyalties belong to heaven. Our loyalties belong to God and to Jesus. And at times that's easy to say and hard to recognize, hard to implement. But we need to remember that Jesus didn't come to found a country. And Jesus didn't come to bless a specific government. Or that he came to reconcile all people to the Father. And we have to be thrust in the middle of governments. It's impossible to live in society without being ruled by a government. If you ever want to see some we're going to refer some to David Lipscomb, one of the past leaders within the Restoration movement, some this morning. If you want to be challenged in your thinking, read some of Lipscomb's position. Because Lipscomb viewed that all civil government, whether it's, no matter where it is, that all civil government is inherently evil, exists only because people refuse to obey God, and that Christians should have nothing to do with it. And a lot of people, I already saw a head shake. No, I don't like that. It's up. That was his position. But the fact is, we have to know how to live within this, how to respond to this, and how to carry on. And some of it, somehow we respond to that will even influence whether or not we suffer for our faith. The interesting thing with Peter saying, live as resident aliens, right after that he talks about honor the powers. He says, live as if you don't belong here, but respect the authorities, even honor the emperor. And then goes on to describe how those authorities were going to put the Christians to persecution and put them to the flame. So, here's this contradiction. Live as if you don't belong here, but belong somewhere else. Honor the authorities around you, but know they're going to persecute you. And in terms of the teaching about honoring the authorities, if you take Peter's teaching and Paul's teaching in Romans 13, and take it all literally, very, this is what we be cautious with, face value completely, then Christians in the United States should have some ambivalence about what we have here. Because according to that teaching, the American Revolution never should have happened. If you're going to honor and submit to the existing government. Well, obviously it did. And things changed. And I'm not saying that was right or wrong. I'm just saying if we want to look at what Scripture says there and how if you interpret it a certain way, then we sometimes find ourselves taking actions that aren't consistent with that. But in Revelation 2, we have this. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the first and the last, who was dead, who has come to life, says this, I know your tribulation and your poverty, tribulation under your suffering, and your poverty, but you are rich. And the blasphemy by those who say they are Jews and are not, for a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested. You'll have tribulation for 10 days. Don't ask me what the 10 days means. Too many interpretations. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. You may remember when Pete was teaching this passage, that Smyrna was an interesting place. Smyrna was a seacoast town, very wealthy. It wasn't that there was poverty in the city, but somehow there were poverty among the Christians. He says, I know your tribulation and your poverty. They were blasphemed by the Jewish community. There was a strong Jewish community in Smyrna. Probably very influential. May have prevented them from actually earning a living. That's how influential the Jewish community was there. So even though the city was wealthy, being a port city and a trade city, somehow the people of the church were not involved in that. And they were suffering financially as well as suffering because of the persecution. And over time, as Pete reminded us, over time, many well-known Christians and early church fathers were martyred in Smyrna. The most famous being a man named Polycarp, who apparently was actually discipled by John and Paul. So that's how far back that went. And Polycarp was there in late in age. Read the martyrdom of Polycarp, and it's an amazing story. He refused. He just refused. He was standing there, he was threatened by lions, he was himself. He was threatened by burning. He said, I'd rather experience these flames for holding my faith than the flames in the future for rejecting my faith. And when they started to nail him to the spot, he said, no need. I'm not running anywhere. And the power that's going to hold me here will also sustain me through this. And it's an amazing story of faith. And many people there were martyred for their faith in Smyrna. And that went on throughout the persecution throughout the early church. You may have noticed at times that initially it was the Jews who were persecuting the church, and the Christians were protected by Rome. You can particularly see that in Paul's ministry. Then eventually Rome said, no, you're not honoring Caesar. So you're not acceptable here. You're atheist because you won't worship the gods. You're atheist because you won't worship Caesar. And that's where it happened. So how is it that Peter can say, honor the emperor, but then they're going to be persecuted because they're disloyal? So does honoring something, honoring and recognizing the authority of something, automatically mean you have to profess loyalty there? I'm seeing a head shake no. I mean, do you have a thought on that, Bill?
All human governments bring law and organization to their citizens, their citizenry. Now, some of those laws may not be good ones, but they also usually prevent invasions by other people to come in and take what you've got and so on. So when you honor the government and you honor the government officials, for one thing, they were created by God. You didn't have anything to do with their creation. So you're honoring someone who was created by God and for whatever reason is serving God's purpose at that point in time, even if the government itself overall isn't all that great. That individual is still serving God's purpose. So you honor them because you honor God. But if that person demands that you call them God and you bow down to them, no, you don't have to do that because you only bow down to the Father in heaven.
Okay, thanks. In terms of governments being in place for a reason, I don't know how, I mean, I didn't celebrate or one way or the other, but some people I know celebrated the fall of the Iron Curtain. Reagan famously referred to it as the evil empire, and there was all the resistance, and I don't argue the need for that. A lot of evil things happened during that regime. But on the other hand, as soon as that fall happened, a centuries-old blood feud reemerged in the Balkans, and millions of people died. So whether we wanted to acknowledge it or not, the force of that evil government, the force of that evil empire, in spite of all the bad things they did, preserved the lives of millions of people for years and years and years. That's how God works within the governments, within the things that he holds there or doesn't hold there. He protects or doesn't protect. And for some of that's an uncomfortable thought. That the Soviet Union might have been used for good and not only for evil. And the question still comes to what is the loyalty demanded? I will say this, I've said this to some of you before, and this is my personal choice. I don't preach this, I don't encourage this, it's just my personal choice. When the Pledge of Allegiance is recited, I will stand out of respect, but I will not recite it. Because I pledge allegiance only one place, and that's to the Lord Jesus. Not to the flag, not to the country. Does that mean I oppose my country? No. I only have one king, only one government. That's my choice. But that's how I assess loyalty. And each person has to determine how they feel, where their loyalties lie on that, or where their strengths or their opinions fall on that. And again, I don't say you should go do this. That's one of those things that I believe we famously within our tradition have, in matters of opinion, we have liberty. Now, all too often, as some of the things we've discussed times, all too often, the fact is that the matters of opinion where all the fights happened, and all the division happened, and all the disappointment within Christianity happened. I mean, I was at least 1 foot, maybe that my second foot was halfway out the door of the churches of Christ over that very thing. Because I saw this continued denial of the fact that Scripture teaches certain things and doesn't teach certain things, and we should not be binding our opinions on others. I almost became a Mennonite. That's after I just almost became nothing. And I've shared this story before about a brother sort of reclaimed me, demanding, after he gained my trust, demanding I make a choice. Either decide that you believe this and show it, or leave, because you're influencing people. There are people who are looking at you. Shocking. Suffering's around us. Suffering's around us in this world. Some of it is because we live here. We live in a fallen world. We live in a place where our bodies are decaying, which is not what God intended from the outset. You know, He created these. He created for life forever. Sin broke that. And so, because of the response to sin, we suffer. And I'm not tying that, as the early Jews did, where you did this and so you're suffering, but rather, suffering is here. Disease is here. Death is here. And the longer we live, the closer we'll get to that end point. But we do suffer because of our sins and our bad decisions. The consequences there are with us, and sometimes they haunt us for a lifetime. Even though we know we're forgiven, we know that God has created us anew, the consequences of those bad decisions are there. But then there is suffering because of loyalty to Christ. Suffering because we stand close to Christ. And there's sort of a puzzling paradox here for us, because Scripture says there will be suffering, not there may be suffering, it says there will be suffering. And if you belong to Jesus, as a disciple, it will lead to suffering, and yet most of us here don't really experience that, do we? Not that type of suffering. And the closest was that.
The one thing I was going to say, if we look at Smyrna, their chief export was myrrh.
Yeah.
It had to be crushed in order to be beautiful.
Yeah.
And you think of people, we have compassion for those being crushed. There's no passion for Trump or someone like that. If you're wealthy and you're just blessed, nobody really wants to love. The church, when it is pressed down and crushed and beaten on, grows because there is a compassion for people that are down. And I think when you look at the passage, he says, you're going to be crushed continuously. Whether you're good or bad or indifferent, you're going to be in this town. You're going to get blamed for everything that happens. And I think that caused the church to thrive, grow, and stay.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, something people have heard me say many times. I believe the worst thing that ever happened to the church is that Constantine made it legal. Because up to that point, it was still considered this, although it was getting more and more acceptable, it still wasn't acknowledged. And as long as it was an underground movement, as long as it was something that was perceived as being not part of the government, it grew. And the pagan writers, there are many places where the pagan writers and historians would say, what do you do with these Christians? They don't just take care of their sick people, they take care of our sick people too. The people who we're going to turn out because we don't want anything to do with them, they take in. Those children that would have been just murdered because, a family, if they didn't want the child, they could just kill them. Christians take in. When the plague began to happen in Europe, the Christians would go into the city. And so they know, well, we'll go in, we may die, we may not. Turns out that if they went in and served there among the people who were suffering with the plague and didn't die from it, after that they were immune. So they could go into another city and another city and another city and serve. And the government around them, who are these guys? And the church grew and grew and grew. And to the point that it was actually considered a threat to the government, not because it would take up arms, they would not fight against the government, they would not take up arms, but because they had more influence, and through more influence, more power than the government did. Not power in the sense of worldly power, but power in the sense of God working in people and doing good. But then eventually Constantine took it on, and then the church began to have struggles. And what I say is that at that point, the church began to struggle with and make the wrong decisions about the very temptations that Jesus rejected. About power and influence, about wealth. And then you have this merging there. At that point, you stopped having the empire and Christianity. You began to have what some authors call Christendom. And suddenly, Christianity and government were one and the same. And it was not for the better. But the suffering that happened, you're right, they were pressed down. How they responded. Even the pagans, so when they saw, I mentioned Polycarp, when they saw how he died, they were amazed. Many people came to faith watching the death of a martyr, watching the peace that person had, watching the strength that person had as the stoning happened. It was Stephen. And even though Saul was saying this is a good thing, he had to be influenced by that. We heard about his, Saul's conversion. He had to be aware that a faith like that was unique. An acceptance like that was unique. And by the way, something else that was unique there, in all of the New Testament after Christ is resurrected, and we see a picture of Christ, other than in Revelation where he's walking the churches, we see a picture of Christ. Where is he? Seated at the right hand of God. With the stoning of Stephen, he stood. I see Christ standing. That got his attention because one of his faithful was being killed. New Testament never suggests that suffering is good, but says it's necessary. The Christian is pictured as having fellowship with Christ's suffering and sharing in his suffering, and that people will suffer because of their faith. To me, the first time I thought I suffered for my faith was my mom. Really, I suffered for her faith. My mom sent the note to my PE teacher to get me exempt from participating in that sinful square dancing they were going to do. I mean, everyone knows that the lusty mind of a 9-year-old boy is just springs to life because of doing a do-si-do around the room. And I was ridiculed by my teacher, by the fellow students. It wasn't even something I believed. She believed it. And that's the closest, for a long time, I felt like I came to suffering for my faith. But there are things that people go through. Karen reminds us consistently of Christians around the world who are being persecuted for their faith. And we know of missionary families that we support who, if you don't know all the story about the Harrisons, they were serving in one place in North Africa and had been there and building relationships, but they knew the tension was building. And finally, in the middle of the night, they got a call, it's time to leave. And so the radio was signaled and the plane flew in and they grabbed what they could, their infant daughter and what belongings they had, and went to the airport and got on the plane, flew out, and 10 minutes later the bomb started dropping. Now they've been still in northern Africa, but further south in areas where they're working among the refugees, and at times that they were face down on the floor, praying while the bullets fly over through their home, because they're there to serve the first purpose and mission of Jesus. But some of these things don't necessarily happen elsewhere. And I share a story, and this is something I share very carefully, because I know that there's some things that people may take exception to. But you may not be aware that the churches of Christ came through something that came to be termed as the Restoration Movement, was part of historically the Second Great Awakening. But from the earliest days of the Restoration Movement, the church leaders, and people like Campbell and Stone and Moses Ward and others, held a pacifist conviction. They felt like Christians should not go to war, should not carry arms and kill other people. And that teaching held strongly through the growth of the church as it expanded. The fact is, the first person, this is something that happened I heard a lot during the Vietnam War, and one of the first people I know of asking the question, should I say my country right or wrong, was Alexander Campbell in 1844. Because he was saying, we're being asked to commit to things that are inconsistent with my faith. And that was consistently there until the Civil War. And the Civil War obviously caused problems. And what happened in the Civil War is the churches in the North, which for the most part are the instrumental Christian churches, or instrumental churches of Christ, but the churches in the North held to the Union position. In fact, James Garfield, one of the prominent leaders then, and later became president, stood in the pulpit in a church in Cincinnati in full uniform, preaching that this was a holy war that they needed to go pursue. The churches in the South primarily held to the conviction that we shouldn't bear arms against some other person. They taught to take a pacifist view. David Lipscomb was known to, actually he and some of the other church leaders wrote to Davis, President of the Confederacy, asking that all young men in the churches of Christ be exempt from the draft. Lipscomb actually had an officer come and listen to his preach to decide if he was preaching against the Confederate government. And the response there was, I can't tell what he was preaching against the Confederate government, but he was certainly preaching for the kingdom of God. And so he was not arrested. They were ready to arrest him. And that tradition continued. And then around the turn of the 1900s, there was a challenge. You may or may not know that it was in 1906, I believe, that the census officially recognized a split between the churches of Christ and the Christian churches, the non-instrumental and the instrumental. About that same time, some things were going on that to me were just, as I look back on it, I can't believe it. Because we see in the news now, the social media and all the attacks and the barbs and people committing suicide because they can't stand the criticism that they're receiving. And social media has nothing on the editors of some of those church papers. Because it wasn't just that they disputed theology or disputed doctrine or argued about opinions. They viciously attacked people. There was two preachers actually published a book to attack another Christian brother by name. And that all the heresy they thought he was teaching, but it was attacking him personally, not his doctrine. And that went on. And so this was the background here. What was going on, but there was still a tradition among some of the churches of Christ of holding a position of pacifism. And then you have the approach of World War I. Before the U.S. entered into the war, the government did just a blitz of information to create animosity towards Germany. They portrayed it as a light against darkness, good against Satan. That every German was someone to be hated and abhorred and feared, and so this was permeating the news. But in western Oklahoma, there was a college, Cordell Christian College, and a man named K.N. Armstrong had become the president. Let's see if I can make any sense of my notes here. And he held to the tradition, and that church and that college held to the tradition of nonviolence and pacifism. Actually, under Armstrong's leadership, it became the largest and most influential college within the Churches of Christ. There in western Oklahoma. But they continued to hold, and all the faculty members, I think all the faculty members and all the board of trustees except one held this view that Christians should not go to war. That we honor our government, we pay our taxes, we obey the laws, and pray to be left alone in peace. That was their view. And he was also the son-in-law of James Harding, and was influenced by Harding and influenced by David Lipscomb. Lipscomb was known to say, war is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And he strongly opposed people going, Christians participating in the war. And again, most of the churches still held past view, but you had this split that was happening with these papers, these journals. And in reality, when I look at that and what was being taught, what was being said, I always come to one conclusion: it was jealousy more than doctrine. And how many of you have gone, if you've been attended here at the Hills for a while, have been out with friends and heard, oh, you're the church that does this. You're the church that does that. I've run into in my family, well, if they're growing that much, they must be doing something wrong. It's jealousy. Not a true look at doctrine or what Scripture teaches or what Scripture allows or how you interpret. It's jealousy. And so there was a strong surge against anything that Harding and Lipscomb stood for. And there at Cordell College, they were encouraging young men to hold a pacifist view. If you're drafted, take a non-combatant role. Two problems with that. Whether or not you could take a conscious objector role was entirely up to the local draft board. It was left to the local draft board to decide. And in Wichita County, Kansas, there will be no conscious objectors. If you were given that status, non-combatant status, you were made a medic. If you know anything about World War I, the two people who were killed first in any battle were the lieutenants and the medics. Lieutenants, because they're the guys, if you've ever watched a film about it, blew the whistle to get the enemy's attention to begin with, and led the charge out of the bunker to go across no man's land. So they were the first person up, first target. You want to see read it very fast. If you're a fan of either C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, I highly recommend you read the book A Hobbit. It was a wardrobe, a hobbit, and a great war. And it's how World War I influenced both those men writing, and how their friendship influenced both of them too, because it was ultimately Tolkien that helped lead Lewis to faith. And it was Lewis' constant encouragement, we've got this encouragement thing going on, Lewis' constant encouragement that caused Tolkien to finish Lord of the Rings. He was going to abandon it. He just thought it wasn't going anywhere, and Lewis just kept after it. It's a fascinating book. But that's an aside. So here we've got this thing where okay, is the draft board going to let you be a conscious objector? If they do, you're probably going to be shocked once you get to the field. But in Wichita County, they were going to have any. And so two young men from Cordell College said, I can't do that. They were immediately sent to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to prison, where they were verbally abused, to the short of beating, physically abused, cajoled, trying in every possible way to get them to drop their conviction that they can't do that. They can't bear arms against another person. To the point that a person who they said was from Washington came and sat with them. The person was weeping and pleading, don't you know you're going to be executed if you don't let go of this position? And they wouldn't. And the next morning, they had their hands tied, they were marched out, they were blindfolded, firing squad marched out, called to present arms, called to aim, but the command to fire was never given. It was all one more thing to try to get them to deny their faith, deny their position. Because their faith, if you think to them, that's what the position they should hold. And they would not. A professor at Cordell Christian had to publish an article that went out in a paper at Gospel Herald that Armstrong, the president of the college, happened to publish. It was intercepted by the mail department, sent to Washington, because during that time frame, two interesting laws were passed. One was not sedition. It was the Espionage Act and then the Sedition Act. And basically it said, if you encourage anyone to not go to war, if you say anything that's counter to the government, if you say anything that would detract from what the government is doing in the minds of other people, you could be fined $10,000 or spend 20 years in prison or both. And so here was this college that had a history of being pacifist. And when the paper was published and Armstrong was taken in, what is now the FBI, that was just the Bureau of Investigation, and the local defense counsel interviewed him. And after days of interview, he finally said, I've held a pacifist view for 26 years. I suppose it's okay if our government fights a defensive war. But a Christian should not take arms. A Christian should be served in some non-combatant role. That wasn't a good answer. And they brought pressure and demanded, let's see if I get the words exactly right. This is July of 1918. The Cordell Christian Board of Regents and faculty be reorganized to unreservedly conform to all the military policies and requirements of the government in the present war. All doctrines and teaching must comply strictly and to the fullest extent with the military policy of the government. Did you know that happened in our country? You know, we look at some of the things that are going on now. A fellow who's taken to court because he doesn't want to prepare a cake because for a same-sex marriage, or other things that are similar to that in the court cases. But we actually had the government tell the person, this is what you must preach. So Cordell Christian College closed its doors. So at that time, you know, this school that was the most largest, most influential college within the Churches of Christ disappeared. Later, Armstrong started another college called Harding College after his mentor and father-in-law. And oh, by the way, in its early days, it held to the same views and tenets and principles that the Christian should not do that. Anybody familiar with the history of Harding College knows that in the 50s that changed. When the president of the college then started something called the Freedom Forum and the National Education Program, where the three principles, and I'm not making this up, the three principles that they emphasized were Constitution, capitalism, Christianity, in that order. So the college changed after a while. And I'm going to say, and leave it to you to make your own judgment about that. But things, sometimes we experience suffering, we experience threat, experience trauma, simply for holding to what we believe is correct. That happens to perhaps to not be consistent with the popular thought of the government or the community around us. Behaviors that can, how am I doing time-wise?
5.
5, okay. Behaviors that can lead to persecution are the loyalty to Jesus that leads other people to hate us. Because if you're exclusively loyal to Jesus and Him alone, there will be people around you that do not like that and will not like you. Not that we want to be liked. We want to have the opportunity to teach and profess our faith. Something that some of you have already experienced. If you speak truth about the morals of the society around us, that can and will lead to persecution. Or loss of business. Perhaps lost a job. And another thing that will be cause people to look at you wrong, let's say, is an active work on behalf of the poor, an active work on the disenfranchised. You know, Peter said you're resident aliens. Live as if you don't belong here. And yet, when some churches have gone to try to open their doors to those who are resident aliens, there are some churches in the U.S. who have taken to open their doors. One could say with the current government's environment, illegally so, to help people who are here without permission. Are we, and we can argue whether or not they should be here. We can argue whether or not there's a right or wrong way to assess the way they got here or why they're here, but they're here. And they're people who have needs and people who have hopes. Obviously, the way of immigrating has changed through the years, but I would guess to say that most of our families, when they moved here, didn't have permission either. But it was a more welcoming place then. And I'm not trying to preach on that. I just want you to be aware that there are things that we can do, things that we may do. I had, he's not here, but a brother sent me a message this week, a message of encouragement about what we're doing here. And he said, we need to be able to speak about what do you do about the same-sex relationships. And I really confess, one of my sisters is in a same-sex relationship, and I struggled. When it came up, I was sent this invitation, asking me to be there with her while they celebrated their union, and God blessed it. And I said, no, God won't bless that. And it's taken years for my sister and I really to come back to where we're understanding each other. It was more my problem than hers on that. I believe she's wrong. But my issue was one of saying, I can't go there. And I still can't go there in terms of what her practice is, but I can love her and try to show her what Christ is doing in me and wants to do in her. So how are we going to deal with this? What are we going to suffer for? What are we willing to suffer for? Are we willing to suffer for taking a strong stand on morals? Are we willing to suffer on whether or not a person should go to war? And I think I registered as a CO. I had and I don't judge anyone who served. My dad and my father-in-law both served in the Navy, and I was proud of their service. But they were equally proud of my decision. I can share you a story real quick. And this is one of those things where you never know how to judge your parents. Because my dad was Mr. Conservative in every way. I won't tell you how conservative because it's embarrassing to me, but during the height of the Vietnam War, I was working with him in his metal shop. One of his customers came in who trusted him a lot and said, Milton, I've got a problem. My son-in-law is about to be drafted. And he's talking about going to Canada. And I just don't think that's right. But on the other hand, I don't want my daughter to be a widow when she's 20 years old. If your son there had this problem, what would you tell him to do? Without skipping a beat, my dad said, tell him to go to Canada. Jaw on the floor. What? Did I just hear that from you? And then he went on to express his reasons why he believed that. But it was one of those startling moments where suddenly I didn't really know the man at all. Now, fortunately, it didn't come to that. But the point is, we need to be able to recognize and make allowances and recognize what may cause things. Do I want to ever stand in a place and have somebody, threaten me physically because I have faith? No. But I hope if it comes, my faith stands strong. And that I'm willing to suffer for that. And not just be embarrassed because my mom did something that was silly. Thanks for your time.